Right now, the United States is managing 3 simultaneous global flashpoints. We are providing the critical support required for a high-intensity war in Eastern Europe, reinforcing a widening conflict in the Middle East, and navigating rising tensions in the Western Pacific. According to political scientist John Mearsheimer, this level of global overextension is the direct result of a flawed, decades-long strategy pursued by the American foreign policy establishment. Curious, we have to ask how the most powerful nation in human history systematically dismantled its own strategic advantages and boxed itself into a series of unwinnable conflicts. In the early 19th century, North America was a crowded landscape of competing imperial claims from the British, Spanish, and Russian empires. American leaders viewed expansion across this map as a cold, strategic requirement for regional survival. To establish regional hegemony, the United States methodically pushed these rival great powers out of the Western Hemisphere. They purchased territory, fought wars, and consolidated land to ensure no other empire could threaten them across a shared land border. This strategy was codified in 1823. This is a handwritten draft of the Monroe Doctrine. It signaled a shift in policy, warning distant European empires that they were no longer allowed to meddle in America's backyard. By securing its own hemisphere and acting as an offshore balancer, the United States built a geopolitical fortress. That physical isolation guaranteed its survival and allowed it to dominate global politics for over a century. That global balance of power collapsed in 1991. The Soviet Union fell, the Cold War ended, and the United States suddenly found itself completely unchallenged. It was the start of the unipolar moment. Without a rival superpower to keep it in check, Washington abandoned the realist playbook. They replaced it with a new doctrine known as liberal hegemony. This strategy launched a global crusade to remake foreign nations. The goal was to transform as many countries as possible into capitalist, liberal democracies through active, often aggressive, intervention. Mearsheimer describes this ideological crusade as America's holiday from realism. The United States decided it could dictate the internal politics of every country on Earth, setting the stage for a massive global backlash. We can see the first major misstep in Europe. Throughout the 1990s, Western leaders believed they could absorb former Soviet states into their own institutions. They began signing documents to expand the NATO military alliance eastward. This animated map shows how NATO borders pushed closer to Moscow between 1999 and 2008. From a realist perspective, pushing a powerful military alliance directly against the borders of another major power is a provocation. Russia viewed this as a direct threat to its security. By ignoring those physical security concerns, the West helped trigger a brutal war in Ukraine. The optimism of the 1990s dissolved into a landscape of shattered tanks and a grinding war of attrition. The United States is now pouring vital military and financial resources into Eastern Europe, bogging itself down in a region that is no longer its top strategic priority. The consequences of this ideology were even more costly in the Middle East. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq, relying on the theory that pulling down a dictator would produce a stable democracy that would then spread across the region. Destroying these governments created massive power vacuums. Rather than spreading democracy, the interventions empowered regional adversaries like Iran and locked the American military into a series of protracted, unwinnable wars. Now, Iran holds immense asymmetric leverage. They have the military capability to choke off the global economy by blocking commercial vessels and energy supplies from traveling through the Strait of Hormuz and other vital shipping lanes. Washington desperately needs to pivot its attention and military assets away from the region. Instead, it is continually dragged back into Middle Eastern quagmires that offer zero strategic benefit. The most costly failure of liberal hegemony happened in East Asia. In the early 2000s, U.S. leaders assumed that if they integrated a backward Chinese economy into global free trade organizations, China would eventually evolve into a peaceful, democratic partner. Look at this chart tracking China's GDP explosion alongside its military spending. The realist rulebook warns that immense wealth translates directly to military power. By fueling China's economic growth, the United States effectively funded its greatest rival. As both of those lines climb, China is using its new wealth to build a blue water navy and advanced weapons systems to push the American military out of the Western Pacific. They are attempting to establish their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. The liberal strategy of engagement spectacularly backfired. By prioritizing free trade and ideological hopes over the balance of power, Washington built up the first true threat to American regional dominance in a century. Because the U.S. military is bogged down in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, it is physically unable to fully execute its crucial pivot to Asia. It cannot concentrate its forces to deter the rising threat in the Pacific. American pressure in both regions has triggered a defensive alignment between Moscow and Beijing. Faced with U.S. containment, Russia has shifted its energy trade to China, while both nations have intensified their joint military exercises and shared intelligence. The unipolar moment is dead. If the United States wants to survive this new multipolar world, it has to abandon its liberal crusades and return to the cold, calculating logic of the realist rulebook.